Today I'm going to tell you probably the most difficult tale I've told to date. It was difficult to work on both because of the harrowing material involved and because of its complexity. This is the story of Suzanne Sevakis. Why was this lady only finally laid to rest 27 years after her tragic death? Suzanne Marie Sevakis was born on the 6th of September 1969 in Livonia, Michigan, in the United States. Her mother, Sandra Willett, and her father, Clifford Sevakis, were high school sweethearts who followed the American dream and married shortly after school. They had a daughter who they named Suzanne. But the Vietnam War was rearing its ugly head, and shortly afterwards Clifford was sent off to fight. This caused the breakdown of their relationship because by the time he came back, by his own admission, the war had affected him drastically and he was not the same man. And Sandra had indeed met someone else. So they separated and Sandra went on to have 2 more children by her new man, but unfortunately that relationship also failed and she ended up living in a trailer park. While she was living in the trailer park, a tornado struck the park and severely damaged their accommodation and really shook Sandra up. She was suffering from what we would call today PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. In those days it was labelled as severe depression. She sought refuge and solace in the church, and this was where her life would take a turn. She met a man called Franklin Floyd, who took an interest in her and her children, and said that he would look after both her and the children, and that he would keep them safe and sound and provide for them. Subsequently, they would marry, but unbeknown to Sandra, Franklin Floyd had a history. To give you the measure of the man, let me give you a rundown on some of the things he'd done in the past. In 1962, Floyd had abducted a girl, and then in 1963 he went on to rob a bank, and then he did some jail time. In 1973, he attacked another woman and was arrested for it. This time he posted bail prior to his trial, but he skipped bail and went on the run. He would then be a fugitive for the next almost 2 decades. So this was the man that Sandra Willett now had in her life and the lives of her children. Now, Franklin Floyd was quite controlling. They were short of money, and at one point Sandra needed diapers or nappies for the children. Because of the shortage of cash, she went to the local store and wrote a cheque, which unfortunately bounced, and that's quite a serious offence in the United States. Because the cheque had bounced, Sandra received 30 days in jail, and while she was in jail, things went completely awry. While she was in jail, Floyd took complete control of her children. He went to a local orphanage and dropped 2 of them off, and then left with just Suzanne. When she got out of jail and found out what had happened, Sandra went straight to the police and asked them for their assistance, but they were not interested. They said, were they married? And she said, yes. And then they said, there's nothing we can do about it. It's a civil matter. You'll have to sort it out yourself. Now, as we get further into the story, I told you it was complicated both in terms of the timeline and the complexity of what went on. And we're now going to skip forward in time to April 1990 and a dark, stormy night on a dark road in Oklahoma City. The 2 guys were driving along in their truck, and suddenly they saw some form of debris on the road, including a shoe. They stopped the truck to investigate what had gone on. As they walked further on and investigated, they saw what looked like a body, and on closer inspection, indeed it was. It was the body of a young girl, possibly in and around her 20s. She was still alive, but she was in a bad way. They called paramedics and the girl was taken to hospital. Now, in the hospital, a neurosurgeon, Dr. Charles Engels, would diagnose her with a severe head trauma, and she was treated to control her blood pressure and to control the swelling in her brain. Once medication had been administered, she was placed in the ICU for monitoring and observation. During this time, her husband, Clarence, came to the hospital and identified the girl as Tonya Hughes, his wife. Now, when she was admitted, nurses noticed she was covered in bruises and old injuries, which aroused their suspicion that there was something more to what had gone on. Some of these injuries were old, not connected with whatever accident had befallen the girl. And despite the best efforts of the medical team, Tonya Hughes passed away in hospital. Clarence called a good friend of Tonya's, Karen Parsley, who worked with her as a dancer. He informed her of the tragic death of Tonya, and Karen was beside herself. After this, she would come to the hospital to see Tonya. And while she was talking to the nurses took her aside and said things just didn't look right, and they suspected foul play. And when she'd come to the hospital, they treated it as a suspected hit and run. But even the doctor who examined her said she looked in pretty good shape for someone who had been hit possibly by a truck. Now, Tonya had a young son called Michael, and the nurses said that when Michael was at the hospital with Clarence, he wasn't talking or saying much at all. Karen actually knew Michael quite well. She had met Tonya back in the fall of 1989, and they had become good friends. But as time went on, when Tonya came to work, she noticed her with more and more injuries. Bruises, scratches, which Tonya just passed off as accidents, but Karen suspected otherwise. She'd already met Clarence and considered that he was quite odd. He was older than Tonya and very, very strange, and he seemed to be very controlling. He would never let Tonya out of his sight with Michael unless he was there. Tonya could never take him out on their own. Karen and other friends who had worked with Tonya thought they had better inform Tonya's mother. So they got the phone book out and they tried to find the number for her. Eventually they found the right person, or who they thought was the right person, and called this lady. She was quite incredulous when she was told that her daughter had died. "What do you mean?" she said. "My daughter was not 20 years old. She died when she was a very, very young baby." All of a sudden it dawned on Tonya's friends. Tonya possibly was not who they thought she was. In fact, who was she? Having spoken to the nurses when they expressed the opinion to Karen that it was foul play, they'd actually given her the number for what's called the DHS in Oklahoma. That's the Department of Human Services. Once Karen suspected that Tonya was not who they thought she was, she phoned the DHS and related all of this information to them. The DHS came and took Michael, the child, into their custody, and he was subsequently placed with foster parents. The two foster parents he went to were Merle and Ernest Bean, and Michael would eventually be with Merle and Ernest for 4 years, and throughout that time Clarence continually tried to get Michael back. He went to court trying to get custody of Michael, but he failed, although he did get visitation rights. It would seem, though, that Michael was not keen on the visits. Every time Clarence came to pick him up, he looked distressed and unhappy. This is according to Merle and Ernest. After this, the Department of Human Services decided to look a bit more deeply into this, and they ordered a paternity test for Michael. This was done, and the results were startling. With Clarence having claimed that Michael was his child with Tonya, the results came back to say something completely contrary. Clarence was not the father of Michael. Once the DHS found this out, they immediately stopped visitation rights, much to the anger of Clarence. On the 12th of September 1994, Michael had gone to school as normal. He attended the Indian Meridian Elementary School. On that day, events again would take a sinister turn. Police got a call that a man had been found duct-taped and handcuffed to a tree in the woods. And it turned out what had happened is that Clarence had walked into the elementary school with a gun. He'd gone to the principal's office and held the principal at gunpoint and said, "I've come for my son and I'm taking him." He then forced the principal at gunpoint to take him to Michael's classroom, where he then ordered Michael out of the classroom and took Michael and the principal out to the parking lot. They got into the principal's vehicle and drove for quite a way, eventually pulling over at the side of a dirt track. And this is where Clarence then took the principal into the woods, handcuffed him to a tree, and used duct tape to tape his head to the tree and cover his mouth so he couldn't scream. Eventually the principal would be found and the authorities were alerted. Billy Carter, the assistant chief of Choctaw Police, brought the FBI in. The FBI agent who was placed in charge was Special Agent Joe Fitzpatrick. Once Joe Fitzpatrick was on the case, he had to bring himself up to speed with all of the detail that he could find. He knew from past experience that it was essential that Michael was found within the first 48 hours. After the first 48 hours in a kidnapping scenario, the chances of finding the abductee alive diminish. So an APB was put out, both on Michael and Clarence. But as he looked into the case file, he saw details about Tonya Hughes and the suspected hit and run. He also saw that she might possibly not be who they thought she was. The other thing that was strange was that Clarence, at the time of her death, had tried to place a claim on an insurance policy on her life. But when he placed that claim, he had to give a social security number, and the number that he gave did not come back to Clarence Hughes. It came back to the name of Franklin Floyd. Now, I've already mentioned to you about Franklin Floyd and the history of crime that he had. It also appeared that he had a lot of other aliases, Trenton Davis, Warren Marshall, to name a couple. It seemed on further investigation that Franklin Floyd was an expert at being on the run and concealing his ID. He was going to be a very difficult man to trace and to catch. The Choctaw Police and Joe Fitzpatrick contacted friends of Tonya, and when they got more details about the hit and run, they started to suspect Floyd in Tonya's death. Now, at the same time in 1994, TV reports started going out regarding the kidnapping of Michael by Clarence Hughes, or as we now know, Franklin Floyd. And one of the people watching one of these news broadcasts was a lady called Jenny Fisher. When she saw the news report, she was absolutely incredulous. The lady in one of the pictures, who supposedly had been killed in a hit-and-run accident, the mother of Michael, she recognised. She phoned her mother and said, "Have you seen the news report? That woman on the news report, the mother of this child that's been abducted, that's Sharon Marshall." Once her mother had seen the report, she concurred. And so the plot thickens. The lady we thought that was Tonya Hughes is now been recognised as a lady called Sharon Marshall. Now, on further investigation, it would soon become clear that Tonya Hughes, aka Sharon Marshall, had once attended school with Jenny Fisher. Jenny Fisher had once been best friends with Sharon Marshall. They had both attended Forest Park Senior High School in Georgia, and Sharon was in the class of '86. Jenny would subsequently show pictures of Sharon, which correlated with the pictures of Tonya in the high school yearbooks. Their friendship had been deep. Jenny would describe it as feeling like she'd known Sharon all of her life. She said that Sharon was a brilliant student. She was in the ROTC, which is like a military cadet. She was also in the science club and what they called the gifted program. Sharon was always very mature for her age, and she said that she wanted to go to Georgia Tech. She had aspirations to study to become an aeronautical engineer. She would go on to get a full scholarship for aerospace engineering at Georgia Tech. In recognition of this, Sharon Marshall's dad took out a full-page advert, which in those days was quite costly, in the yearbook. But some of her friends found it quite strange. Normally when families take out full-page adverts in things like school yearbooks, they post a picture of the person as a child or a young baby even. The picture that Sharon Marshall's dad chose for the yearbook, the full-page advert, was rather I can only describe it as sexy photo. Why would a father do that? Why would he put a sexy photo of his daughter in the school yearbook? It began to arouse suspicions amongst her friends. Jenny Fisher had met Mr. Marshall once when he'd brought Sharon to their house, and she considered him a bit weird. Sharon's dad was bringing her up alone, and when Jenny had asked Sharon about her mum, she said that she'd been killed in an accident. She'd been hit by a car on a bridge, and this had happened when Sharon was in the 2nd grade. Now at home, Sharon was kept close by her dad. She was responsible for cooking all the meals. She was not allowed to use the phone, and she was only allowed out on her own very, very occasionally. And it only gets worse from there. One day, Sharon called Jenny and said that she was pregnant. When Jenny heard that Sharon was pregnant, it came as no surprise to her. Throughout the period at high school that she'd known Sharon, she'd also realised that Sharon was being regularly abused, both physically and sexually, by her father, Warren. She knew this for a fact because on one particular occasion when she stayed over at Sharon's, she was witness to it. It was a particularly harrowing night. She was staying over at Sharon's and Warren, Sharon's father, came into the bedroom where Sharon and Jenny were getting undressed for bed. So they were half naked, basically. He threatened them and shouted at them and then left the room. But after that, he came back and he had a gun. He threatened Jenny, got her to lie down, and then he raped his own daughter at gunpoint. When Sharon told Jenny that she was pregnant, Jenny was saying, well, what are you going to do? And she said, I'm going to put it up for adoption. She also said that her dad would not now let her go to college on her scholarship. Jenny was incredulous. She said, you're brilliant. Why can't you go? And she said, someone has to look after Daddy. Now, shortly afterwards, as Sharon's time for giving birth was nearing, she phoned up Jenny and said that she and her father were leaving shortly for Arizona, where she was going to have the baby and then she was going to put it up for adoption. Now, after this particular period in Sharon's life, she moved around a bit with her father. At one point, she was working in a club as a pole dancer, strip dancer, whatever you'd like to call it. One of the clubs she worked at was the Mons Venus Club in Tampa. This was an adult entertainment club, and one of the people that worked there alongside Sharon was a lady called Heather Lane, and she knew Sharon quite well. She said Sharon was shy and reserved and didn't really talk about her past. But what she did say was that she had a dad, and she talked quite regularly about her weird or strange relationship with her dad. Now, this club was supposed to be strictly non-sexual. However, on one particular occasion, Heather was called out by one of the other members of the club to say that Sharon was outside one of the restrooms and she was offering, shall we say, other services to the gentlemen that frequented the club for $50 a time. When Heather intervened and pulled Sharon aside, she said that her dad had forced her to do it, and that indeed he'd actually given her a supply of condoms to do the work. Now, quite naturally, as any person would be, Lane was disgusted. How could a father force his daughter into doing that kind of thing? And it was during the period that she was working at the club that Sharon became pregnant with Michael. When she subsequently gave birth to Michael, the relationship between her and her son was described as magical. She doted upon the boy and everyone could see it. Eventually they would move on from Tampa, and in 1989, a year before Tonya Hughes died, Sharon and Warren Marshall changed their names. She became Tonya Hughes and he became Clarence Hughes, and they got the names off of gravestones in Alabama. After this, using, I can only presume, false documentation, they went on to New Orleans, where they got married. Yes, they got married. Clarence Hughes, who was supposedly the father of Tonya Hughes, married his own daughter. Let me know what you think of that in the comments below. I myself find it completely outrageous and disgusting. Now, this is where we have to jump in the timeline again to the time of Michael's abduction. Approximately 2 months after he was abducted from his elementary school, police finally caught up with Franklin Floyd. They thought that he would start using one of his aliases again, and they were right. He used one of his old aliases to try and get a driver's license, and he was swooped on and arrested in Louisville, Kentucky. After this, he went on trial in 1995, and a judge handed him a lengthy prison sentence for the abduction of Michael. But sadly, Michael had not been found with him and his whereabouts were not known. During the investigation, Floyd's accommodation and vehicle were searched and a number of photographs were turned up. Some of these photographs were of a lady called Cheryl Comesso. Cheryl Comesso had been a dancer at the Mons Venus Club alongside Sharon Marshall. Cheryl Comesso had died and her remains had been found in 1995. And it was determined from the examination of her remains that she'd been murdered in 1989. And police basically thought that Floyd was responsible. They thought that he'd fled Tampa with Sharon Marshall because he had killed Cheryl Comesso. They had changed their names and then they had got married. After further investigation in 1997, Franklin Floyd was charged with the first-degree murder of Cheryl Camesso, and he was sentenced to death. After this, he was placed on death row in one of the major penitentiaries. But throughout this period, people were still trying to work out who Tonya Hughes, aka Sharon Marshall, actually was. And it would not be until 2014, during an interview with 2 FBI agents, that more light would be shed upon this. An investigative author called Matt Burbach had started to write a book called A Beautiful Child about the goings-on in this case. And the case really put the hook in him. He really wanted to find out the real identity of this lady. He teamed up with the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children and asked for DNA tests to be performed. These tests were performed on relatives of several girls who had gone missing in the 1970s. These DNA tests led to the discovery of a biological daughter of Tonya Hughes, aka Sharon Marshall. And this discovery led to the case being reopened by the FBI and the involvement of 2 agents, Scott Lobb and Nate Furr. Now, these 2 agents had 2 burning questions. They wanted to know what had happened to Michael, and they wanted to know the real identity of the lady in question. And for this, they went to visit Franklin Floyd in prison to ask him a number of really serious questions. Now, on the first subject, what happened to Michael, the answer eventually came out after a fairly contentious exchange between the agents and Franklin Floyd. Floyd eventually admitted to killing Michael by shooting him in the back of the head twice. During this interview, they questioned him further about Sharon Marshall's identity, and eventually he broke and told them her real identity. Sharon Marshall was actually Suzanne Sevakis, the girl who had been taken away from Sharon Willett all those years ago. Now, at that time, Sandra Willett and Clifford Sevakis, Suzanne's parents, were both still alive, and they were both informed of what had happened to their daughter. Can you imagine how these people were feeling, knowing that their daughter had been through such a life and all of this trauma? As the FBI agents delved further, the biological daughter that had been identified was also informed about her biological mother. This girl was called Megan Dufresne, and she'd been placed up for adoption by Suzanne in 1989. But when she found out what had happened to her mother and what her mother had been through all of her life, she expressed feeling a kind of anger about it. Who wouldn't? Now, when she was spoken to about her daughter Suzanne, Sandra Willett expressed that possibly she could have done something more to protect her daughter, but it was far too late now, and she was filled with regret. Whether or not this was the case, we'll never know, because Megan Dufresne's adoptive parents actually reached out to Sandra to see if she wanted to form a relationship with her granddaughter Megan, but she declined. She didn't really want to know Megan. Some weird family dynamics going on here. And Megan Dufresne would eventually go on to have a son herself, who she named Michael after her late brother. In 2017, there was a gathering in the graveyard where Tonya, aka Sharon, aka Suzanne, was buried. Present were Megan, Suzanne's father, Clifford, and various friends of Suzanne, and also Joe Fitzpatrick, the FBI officer. And at this little gathering, a new gravestone was unveiled, which this time, instead of just Tonya, had the full name of the person who was buried beneath it, Suzanne Marie Sevakis. And finally, after 27 years, Suzanne Marie Sevakis was finally, properly laid to rest. And after that quite harrowing story, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe. And thank you for watching.